Chapter 1. The Sinking Shadow. Charles Smith sat alone on the porch of his small, weather-beaten cabin deep in the Appalachian foothills, the early morning fog curling like ghostly fingers through the skeletal branches of gnarled oaks. Once, he had been a man of the sea, a captain of a proud merchant vessel navigating the Atlantic's treacherous waters. But that life was buried beneath waves of disgrace and self-loathing, like a shipwreck lost to the abyss. Now Charles was just another coal miner, scraping a living far from the ocean's salt and spray. The letters from his family no longer came. The old Smith estate in Virginia, once a bastion of aristocratic pride, had turned its back on him the moment the news broke. Charles had abandoned the Anastasia as she sank into the blackened sea. Hundreds perished, their cries swallowed by the storm, and the captain's cowardice became a public spectacle. The aristocratic name he carried was sullied beyond repair. The Smiths disowned him, and society's whispers became daggers in his back. Coal dust stained his hands and lungs, but it was the darkness beneath the earth that gnawed at him now. The mines of West Virginia were far from the world he knew, yet the shadows there bore a weight equal to the ocean's depths, the weight of secrets, of unseen horrors lurking just beyond the flickering lamplight. Each shift underground felt like a descent into madness. Today, as Charles prepared for work, a tall man with sharp eyes approached, Ravi Malone, the mine's engineer. Ravi was one of the few who treated Charles without the sneer of judgment. "You ready for another day in hell, Smith?" he asked, offering a rare, brief smile. Charles nodded, though his heart was heavy. Hell's just another word for home. He glanced toward the tunnel entrance, where a rough-looking man loomed, a new worker with a dangerous aura. The man's name was Mangle Reed, an escaped convict, rumored to be hiding under an alias. His presence unsettled the miners, stirring old fears of violence and unrest. But it was what lay beneath the mine that truly haunted Charles. Years ago, these coal seams had been dug beneath the ruins of a forgotten estate, the Blackwood Mansion, once home to a wealthy old family with whispered ties to dark rituals. Locals spoke of a secret satanic cult that had been driven out after a series of brutal murders. The mansion had burned down, in a fire no one could explain, leaving only charred stones and a lingering malevolence. As Charles descended into the mine that morning, the beams of his lamp cut through the suffocating blackness. The air was thick with damp earth and something else, a faint, metallic scent that twisted his stomach. He paused, hearing a distant echo, a soft chant, barely audible, like a fading prayer from the abyss. He swallowed hard and pressed forward, dread settling into his bones. Today would not be like the others. Somewhere deep within these tunnels, the past was waiting, and Charles Smith was about to confront a darkness far older and darker than any storm at sea. As the earth trembled faintly beneath his boots, Charles realized he was not alone, and the shadows were waking. Chapter 2. The Shadows Beneath Black Ridge Mine. The coal dust clung to Charles Smith like a second skin, gritty and suffocating as he descended into the yawning maw of Black Ridge Mine. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rusting machinery, a stifling reminder of the darkness that swallowed the sunlit world above. Each step echoed like a dirge, the creaks and groans of the old mine weaving an eerie symphony beneath the Appalachian hills. Charles paused at the base of the stairwell, his lungs burning from the stale air, and glanced over at the tall figure leaning against the mine's rusted railcar. "Mr. Malone," Charles greeted, nodding toward the man with a shadowed face. Jack Malone, the site engineer, wiped sweat from his brow and offered a grim smile, his eyes sharp despite the grime. "Charles, glad you made it down without falling into the abyss already," Malone said dryly. Before Charles could reply, a rough voice interrupted from the flickering light of the far tunnel. "Watch your step, Smith." The growl belonged to Marcus Manny Grayson, a burly man whose reputation preceded him. An escaped convict hiding under a borrowed name, Manny's presence at Black Ridge was an uncomfortable secret whispered about in the miners' huddles. His gaze was hard, unreadable, but Charles sensed the simmering tension beneath. The mine was a labyrinth of narrow shafts and forgotten corridors, but beneath it lay something far older, something darker. The old family estate on the surface, once belonging to the venerable Hawthorne lineage, had a sinister secret buried within its grounds. The miners had long whispered of the old ways, Rituals performed in the catacombs beneath the land, a fallen satanic cult whose blood-stained history stained the soil itself. Charles clenched his fists as memories clawed at the edges of his mind. The sinking of the SS Meridian wasn't just a failure, it was a betrayal of trust, a nightmare that haunted him relentlessly. The miners might owe their lives to Blackridge's coal, but for Charles, the mine was a reminder of the depth of his own despair. Jack Malone approached, holding out a lantern that cast flickering shadows across the jagged walls. There's been talk of strange noises down in Shaft 6. The foreman wants us to check it out. Could be a structural issue, or something else. Charles exchanged a wary look with Manny, whose brow furrowed in suspicion. Something else? Manny's voice dropped to a whisper. Around here, that means ghosts. A cold chill raced down Charles' spine, and he swallowed hard. The legends were not just stories. Old Delacroix Manor, looming over the valley like a specter, had long been abandoned after a series of disappearances decades ago. The satanic cult's mark was still whispered about in hushed tones, and blood rites that twisted the souls of all who delved too deep. Angelina Vale, the mine's clinic doctor, appeared suddenly, her presence like a balm in the oppressive atmosphere. Charles, I know this place dredges up old wounds, but you can't run forever, she said softly, her eyes searching his. There was warmth there, a fragile tether to sanity in the encroaching darkness. He nodded, but as the three of them moved toward Shaft 6, a distant rumble echoed through the tunnels. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a faint, anguished wail drifted from the shadows, neither wind nor man-made. Charles stopped, heart pounding, listening as the darkness itself seemed to breathe. Whatever's down here, Malone muttered, gripping his lantern tighter, we're not meant to find it. And somewhere deep beneath Blackridge, something was waiting, watching. Chapter 3. Beneath the Ashen Veil. The air in the mines was thick with a choking blend of dust and despair, the stale scent clinging to Charles Smith's lungs like a curse. He wiped the grime from his forehead, eyes adjusting to the flickering light of the carbide lamp strapped to his helmet. Around him, the claustrophobic tunnels echoed with the distant clang of pickaxes and murmurs, shadows shifting like restless spirits. Charles had never imagined his life would come to this, a former merchant marine captain reduced to clawing through the earth for coal, burying his shame beneath layers of rock and soot. The sinking of the Margaret Ann haunted him relentlessly, each face lost to the waves, a ghost in his mind. When his family disowned him, he sought exile in the Appalachian mines, hoping the darkness would swallow his guilt whole. Tonight, the mine felt different. The usually steady drip of water from the cavern ceiling had turned into a sinister rhythm, punctuating the silence like a heartbeat. Charles glanced toward the deeper shafts, where strange symbols had recently been discovered, ancient markings etched crudely into the stone walls. The foreman dismissed them as relics of the past, but Charles felt a chill each time he passed. "Mr. Smith," came a whispered voice, trembling beneath the weight of fear and urgency. It was Daniel Harper, the young engineer overseeing the ventilation systems. "Something's wrong down in Shaft 7. The sensors are picking up unusual readings. Carbon monoxide levels are spiking, but the fans show no faults." Charles frowned. The miners respected Daniel for his calm logic, but tonight the man looked pale, fingers twitching nervously around his clipboard. Before Charles could respond, a guttural growl rumbled from the depths below, a sound so unnatural it stopped everyone mid-breath. The lamps flickered violently, plunging them into brief darkness before sputtering back to life. "Did you hear that?" Daniel whispered, eyes wide. Charles' heart hammered as a cold wind blew through the tunnel, carrying with it a faint, rancid odor, like burnt flesh and decayed earth. "Stay close," Charles ordered, gripping his pickaxe tightly. "We're heading down to check it out." They descended deeper, the walls closing in, the oppressive silence broken only by their careful steps. The further they went, the more the air grew thick with dread, as if unseen eyes traced their movements from the blackness. Suddenly, Charles stopped abruptly. Scrawled on the wall, smeared in what looked disturbingly like rusted blood, was a symbol, an inverted pentagram entwined with serpentine figures. It pulsed faintly under the lamplight, as if alive. "Damn it," Charles muttered. This was no miner's graffiti. Daniel swallowed hard. The rumors of a cult practicing dark rites in the caves beneath the property. They were said to have vanished decades ago, but some say they never truly left. A low, mocking laughter echoed through the shaft, bouncing off the walls. It was a sound that no living man could have made, chilling every nerve. Charles turned, eyes scanning the darkness. We're not alone down here. From the shadows, a pair of eyes glowed, a sickly yellow, unblinking, watching. The growl rose again, closer and angrier. As the shaft's narrow passage seemed to close like the lid of a coffin, Charles realized that the mine's ancient darkness hid not only coal, but something far older and far more terrifying. Chapter 4. Blood ties beneath ash and stone. Charles Smith wiped the grime from his face, sweat mingling with coal dust, leaving streaks across his weathered skin. The labyrinthine tunnels of the Black Hollow mine seemed endless, choked with oppressive darkness that swallowed the faint glow of their helmets. The air hung heavy, damp, suffocating, and alive with a sinister pulse that gnawed at his nerves. Since arriving at the mine, Charles had been haunted, not just by the weight of his past, but by an unseen presence creeping through the shafts. The old miners whispered tales of the Hollow's curse, stories dismissed by the outside world as coal dust delusions. Yet, as shadows flickered against the jagged walls, Charles felt the old legends clawing at reality. "Hey, Smith," came a gruff voice. Charles turned to see Mike Donovan, the site engineer overseeing safety protocols. Mike's usual sharp gaze was clouded with worry. "There's trouble at the west shaft. Mangan's been pinned under a collapsed beam. It's bad." Charles's heart hitched. Mangan Grant was an enigma, a convicted felon who had slipped into the workforce under an alias, his past buried beneath layers of resentment and defiance. The two had clashed fiercely before, but a strange truce had formed after Charles had given Mangan blood during a near-fatal injury weeks ago. That act had cracked their brittle animosity into something resembling respect. Now, with Mangan trapped and the mine groaning ominously, Charles felt the sharp edge of guilt and responsibility cut deep. Rushing toward the west shaft, he found a team frantically trying to lift rubble. Mangan's face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, his breaths shallow but stubborn. "Hold on, Mangan, we're getting you out," Charles said, voice steady despite the fear tightening his throat. As the rescuers pried away the debris, an unnatural chill swept through the tunnel, freezing the sweat on Charles's brow. The stale mine air twisted into whispers, voices not carried by the wind, but carved from shadows themselves. The ancient superstitions of Black Hollow whispered warnings no one dared voice aloud. Suddenly the ground trembled, a low rumble echoing through the cavern. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered violently. Charles's helmet light caught a flash of something, a twisted symbol etched deep into the rock face, half swallowed by coal and stone, a pentagram warped in bleeding purple shadows. "God help us," Mike muttered, eyes wide with terror. "Get Mangan out, now," Charles barked, but the earth beneath them shuddered again, more violently this time. The miners scrambled as a sudden fissure cracked open, swallowing the far end of the tunnel in darkness. Charles glanced back at Mangan, who struggled to speak through cracked lips. "The Hollow, it's waking," he gasped. Before Charles could answer, unseen hand brushed his neck. The whispers surged into a deafening roar, and the darkness pressed closer, thick, alive, hungry. The Black Hollow was hungry, and it had just begun to feed. Chapter 5. The Echoes Beneath. The air in the mine had grown colder with each passing day, a creeping chill that seemed to seep into the bones of every man and woman who toiled underground. Charles Smith wiped the grime from his brow, the flicker of his flashlight barely penetrating the dense blackness around him. The narrow tunnel echoed with the distant drip of water, a slow, mocking reminder of the floodwaters inching ever closer. Charles's thoughts were a storm of guilt and determination. The ghosts of his past, the shipwreck, the abandoned passengers, the shame, clung to him as tightly as the coal dust on his skin. But here, deep beneath the Appalachian hills in West Virginia, in the heart of the abandoned Ravenwood coal mine, he sought a grim sort of redemption. Angelina Vale had visited him that afternoon. Her presence was a fragile thread of light in his dark world, soft-spoken but unwavering. She carried the weight of her own secrets, the whispered stories of an aristocratic Vale family that had once ruled these lands, before the curse of the old Hollow cult had shattered their legacy. Angelina had urged him to face the darkness, not just the one in the earth, but the one festering inside his soul. Charles, she'd said quietly, the mine isn't just a pit of coal and rock, it's a scar. The cult left more than empty tunnels, they left something restless. We have to be careful. The old laws, the rules of that place, still bind it, and those who break them vanish. Charles had scoffed at first, the pragmatic captain in him unwilling to entertain superstition. But the strange occurrences, the flickering lights, the whispers that seemed to crawl from the shadows, had begun to erode his certainty. The work site buzzed with unease. Mr. Duval, the coal company's ruthless owner, pushed the men harder, ignoring safety protocols to meet impossible quotas. The pressure mounted, tensions frayed, and bitter rivalries ignited. Charles had forged a fragile alliance with Jack Malone, the mine's chief engineer, and Eli Turner, a grizzled miner with a criminal past and a heart buried beneath layers of grime and regret. Jack and Eli had their own reasons for fighting. Jack's quiet love for Sarah, the nurse at the nearby town clinic, and Eli's haunted eyes that held memories darker than the mine itself. They spoke in hushed tones about the old cult's rights, about the unspoken rules that kept the restless dead at bay. Breaking those rules invited something far worse than accidents. Last night, while inspecting a newly breached tunnel, Charles felt it, a low vibration beneath his feet, a presence watching. Shadows seemed to ripple, taking shapes that vanished when he blinked. The air thickened, and a scent like burnt incense and decay filled his lungs. He heard a whisper, not a voice, but a breath, a name carried on the stale air. Charles's heart hammered as the realization settled like frost in his veins. The mine was no mere hole in the earth. It was a gateway, and tonight the old rules would be broken. A scream shattered the brittle silence from deep within the shafts. Charles grabbed his lamp, signaling Jack and Eli. We've got trouble. The three men plunged into the darkness, their steps swallowed by the endless tunnel. Somewhere below, something ancient and unforgiving was waking, and it wanted them to pay. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down with every footfall. Ahead, the ground trembled. Charles stopped, his breath caught. A cold hand brushed his shoulder, but when he spun, there was no one there. Only the darkness, only the dread, and the echo of that single word, remember. Chapter 6. Beneath the Black Veil. Charles Smith had always thought the mines were just dark, damp graves of forgotten labor. Yet tonight, as he wiped the grime from his face, the shadows seemed to breathe, to whisper secrets in a language older than the earth itself. The stale air hung heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen, something festering below the surface. Angelina Vale's voice echoed faintly through the cavern, her footsteps soft but deliberate against the cracked stone. As the camp's physician, she often strayed into the tunnels to check on the miners, but tonight her presence felt different, more urgent, more fragile. Charles, she called softly, her tone laced with concern, you can't keep carrying this alone. He turned, his eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the lanterns. I don't know how to let go, Angelina. The sinking of the Liberty Star, the men I left behind. His voice cracked, the confession choking him like the coal dust itself. Angelina stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm with a warmth that seemed almost unnatural in this freezing underworld. You're not that man anymore. You're here, alive, fighting. From deeper within the tunnels, a faint, ragged whisper slithered through the darkness. It was the voice of Mangan, the escaped convict turned ally, whose scars told stories far darker than his past crimes. His defiance against Seth Danvers was legendary among the miners, but tonight even his courage seemed brittle. Suddenly the ground trembled, a low rumble that morphed into a groan from the earth itself. The ancient mines, long neglected and ignored, responded to some malevolent will. Charles's lantern flickered wildly as a cold wind swept through the corridor, carrying with it a stench of rot and sulfur. We need to get back, Angelina urged, her voice barely above a whisper. But Charles stayed rooted, eyes scanning the jagged walls, where faded symbols, the remnants of that satanic cult rumored to have sacrificed souls here centuries ago, glowed faintly in the moonlight, filtering through cracks above. Their twisted shapes writhed like living things, mocking the living for daring to trespass. Then came a scream, a raw, guttural sound from the far end of the shaft. It was Mangan, Charles felt his heart quicken, the old fear clawing back. But this was no ordinary danger. It was as if the mine itself was hungry, pulling them deeper into its black heart. Angelina grabbed Charles's arm. "We're not alone down here. Something's waiting." He swallowed hard, the crushing silence that followed the scream, heavier than the darkness. His mind raced with images of drowning men, broken promises, and the names he'd vowed never to forget. And now, beneath the cursed soil of Danvers mine, those ghosts were stirring, ready to claim more than just flesh, plunging them into near total blackness. Somewhere in the shadows, the unholy whispering grew louder, promising salvation, or something far worse. Charles tightened his grip on Angelina's hand. "We have to keep moving, before it's too late." But deep in the bowels of the earth, the mine's true horror was already waking. Chapter 7. The Flooded Depths. The coal mine's iron gates groaned under the weight of forgotten secrets, a black maw yawning beneath the rugged hills of West Virginia. Charles Smith stood at the edge of the pit, the bitter wind cutting through his worn jacket as water dripped steadily from the cavern ceiling. The air was thick with damp decay, the silence punctuated only by distant echoes, whispers of something unseen lurking in the shadows. The accident had come without warning. Charles's breath hitched as he looked over at Victor Malone, the mine's engineer, whose face was pale and drawn. "The water's rising faster than the pumps can handle," Victor said, voice tight with urgency. "If this keeps up, the lower shafts will be sealed off in less than an hour." Charles swallowed hard. He had faced death before, abandoned on that doomed freighter, the crushing weight of failure clawing at his soul, but nothing prepared him for this. Here, beneath the earth, the darkness was no longer just absence of light. It was alive, watching. "Where's Mason?" Charles asked, glancing toward the cluster of miners huddled near the shaft entrance. Mason Brooks, the rough-edged man with a criminal past, had been causing friction among the crew for weeks, but today he was missing. Victor's jaw tightened, down in Shaft 3 with the others. Charles's heart sank. Shaft 3 was the deepest, most treacherous part of the mine. Floodwaters had already started seeping in. A shudder rippled through his body as he pictured Mason and the men trapped below, swallowed by the cold blackness inch by inch. "Angelina's coming," Victor added, nodding toward the gate where Dr. Angelina Vale appeared, her dark hair tied back, face pale but resolute. She wasn't just a doctor. Angelina was their tether to sanity, the only one who understood the torment Charles carried beneath his stoic surface. She approached, eyes flickering with a strange, otherworldly light. "We need to get everyone out. Now." Charles met her gaze. The flicker of fear he refused to show mirrored in her own. "I'll lead the rescue. Victor, you coordinate the pumps. Angelina, stay close." As they descended into the choking darkness, the mine seemed to breathe around them. Breaths exhaled in cold, wet gasps that stirred the fevered imaginations tormenting Charles's mind. The walls seemed to pulse, ancient marks etched deep into the rock glowing faintly, as if alive. "Those symbols," Angelina whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. "They're the remnants of the Black Hollow cult. They believed the mine was a gateway." "Gateway to what?" Charles asked, the edge of panic sharpening his voice. "Something beyond our understanding," she said. "They performed rituals down here decades ago. Sacrifices, blood offerings. The locals say the mine is cursed." Charles clenched his fists. He hadn't believed in curses. Suddenly, a distant scream echoed through the tunnels, raw, desperate. "Mason, move," Charles barked, heart racing. The water was rising faster, cold as death itself, threatening to drown their hope. They found the trapped miners huddled in a collapsing chamber, faces etched with terror. Mason lay unconscious, a deep gash marring his forehead. Charles knelt, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but steady. "We're getting you out," Charles promised, voice low but fierce. As they turned to retreat, the dark seemed to shift, whispering voices curling around their minds, shadows writhing like living things. Charles felt a cold hand brush his shoulder, though no one was there. Angelina's voice was a breath in the darkness. "This place, it's alive. It feeds on fear." The narrow path back was flooded, the water now ankle-deep. Charles's boots slipped, the icy chill crawling up his spine. Behind them, a guttural growl echoed, a sound not made by any animal, but something far older. Charles dared not look back. The cavern trembled, and the water surged. Chapter 8. Into the Abyss. Charles Smith's boots thudded against the slick wooden planks of the decrepit shaft house, the old coal mine's forgotten artery. The air hung heavy with the sickly scent of damp earth and decay, thick with the metallic tang of rust. Somewhere deep below, the mine groaned, a living beast, trapped beneath layers of rock and shadow. The flooding was worse than anyone had feared. The rainstorm from the night before had broken the weakened dam holding back the underground reservoir, sending a torrent through the labyrinthine tunnels. Scores of miners remained trapped, voices swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Charles could taste the bitter guilt rising in his throat, a cold echo of the shame that had haunted him since that sinking ship long ago. "Smith," came a rasped whisper from the shadows. Ravi Malhotra's face emerged beneath the flickering beam of a handheld lantern. His eyes bore the marks of exhaustion and pain, but his voice remained steady. "We can't wait any longer. The air's running out down there." Charles nodded grimly. "We'll find them. We have to." Behind them, the shaft house creaked ominously. Seth Donraj's greed had turned this place into a death trap, and now the earth itself seemed to conspire against them. The two men descended into the darkness, their lanterns barely piercing the suffocating black. The walls whispered secrets, in a language older than time, low moans curling around the beams like smoke. Charles's heart pounded, each step deeper into the mine eroding the fragile barrier between reality and nightmare. "Do you feel that?" Ravi muttered, voice barely audible. "It's like something's watching us, waiting." Charles swallowed hard. He did feel it, the weight of unseen eyes, cold and merciless, pressing against his sanity. The mine wasn't just collapsing tunnels and rising water. It was alive in some twisted, malevolent way. Suddenly, a faint, wet scraping echoed from the depths, followed by a low, guttural growl. Charles froze, his lantern light swinging wildly. Shadows began to shift unnaturally along the walls, coalescing into grotesque shapes that writhed with a life of their own. "Keep moving," Charles urged, voice cracking with a fear he couldn't suppress. But the darkness laughed, a dry, rasping sound that burrowed under his skin. They rounded a bend and stopped abruptly. Ahead, where the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, the flooding waters churned black as oil. Floating on the surface were twisted forms, shapes that were neither fully human nor beast. Faces with hollow eyes and mouths agape in silent screams, reaching out with skeletal hands. Charles's breath hitched. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into his bones. "Ravi," Charles whispered, "we're not just racing time. We're trespassing somewhere cursed." A distant clatter echoed behind them. They spun around to see looming silhouettes emerging from the shadows, miners trapped not only by the flood, but by something far darker. "Charles!" a voice cried. It was Angelina Vale, her face pale under the dwindling lantern light, eyes wide with terror. "They're coming! The shadows, they're breaking through!" Charles's jaw clenched. The rescue mission had become a descent into a nightmare that refused to end. As the dark figures closed in, the walls seemed to pulse with a malignant life, and the whispered chanting of a long-forgotten cult echoed from the abyss below. In that breathless moment, Charles realized they were no longer just fighting water or man-made disasters. They were battling the very darkness that had haunted this land for centuries, and the darkness was winning. To be continued. Chapter 9. Beneath the Hollow. The air down in the old hollow mine was thick with the heaviness of a storm yet to come. Charles Smith's breath came ragged, the stale scent of coal dust mingling with something far darker, an ancient rot that seemed to cling to the walls like a curse. The shafts echoed with the distant drip of water, each drop a sinister heartbeat in the oppressive silence. Charles adjusted the flickering lamp strapped to his helmet and glanced at his two companions. Rachel Maloney, the company's young engineer with fierce determination etched across her face despite the grime, limped beside him, clutching her side where a jagged nail had pierced her during the collapse. And then there was Marcus Kane, once a convict, now a reluctant brother-in-arms, his usually cocky demeanor replaced by grim resolve. They moved cautiously, following the narrow tunnel where the floodwaters had trapped dozens of miners hours ago. The shaft was supposed to be long abandoned, a forgotten relic of the hollow's dark past, whispered about by locals as a place where an old satanic cult had once performed blasphemous rites deep underground. Charles had dismissed the stories as superstition until tonight. A low, guttural whisper seemed to rise from the blackened stone around them. Charles stopped, heart hammering as the sound grew, twisting into a chorus of agonized voices. He shook his head, trying to focus. It's just the wind, or nerves. We have to keep moving. But Rachel clutched his arm, pale as death. Did you hear that? It's like they're calling us. Marcus scoffed but didn't move forward. This place has always been cursed. Old man Danry, what's his name? The owner, he didn't care about the lives buried down here. Profit was his only religion. Now it's like the mine's hungry. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a slow, oozy flood of water seeped into the tunnel, creeping closer with unnatural speed. Charles's stomach curved with a rising tide of dread. But worse was the vision that uncoiled before him. Faint shapes flickering in the shadows, pale spectral figures clutching the walls, their hollow eyes empty yet accusing. He blinked hard. The miners trapped below, or the restless dead of the hollows past. Their whispering grew louder, chanting in a broken, forgotten tongue, merging with the roar of the flood. Rachel's voice barely a whisper. We shouldn't be here. The cult's mark is on this place. It's watching. Charles gripped his lamp tighter. We're almost at the cavern where they're trapped, if we don't reach them soon. A sudden bone-chilling scream tore through the tunnel, shattering the fragile silence. Marcus stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror as something unseen yanked at his ankle. Charles looked down and saw tendrils of black water spiraling upward, taking on sinister, clawed forms. Run, Charles shouted, dragging Rachel along as the flood swelled behind them, carrying with it the unholy promise of death. But as they fled, the tunnel forked, one path leading deeper into the darkness, the other collapsing under the relentless pressure of the rising waters. Charles stopped, heart pounding. To the left, salvation. To the right, certain death. A whisper, cold as the grave, floated on the air. Choose wisely, or be forever lost beneath the hollow. Chapter 10. Beneath the hollow veil. Charles Smith's breath was shallow, the damp chill of the flooded mine seeping into his bones as he clung to a jagged edge of the collapsed tunnel. Behind him, the distant cries of trapped men echoed like the wails of ghosts long forgotten. Above ground, the moon hung low and swollen, its pale light swallowed whole by thick storm clouds. Somewhere, far above the hollow earth, Seth Duval's greed still festered, an unseen curse bleeding through cracked stone and shattered lives. It had been hours since Charles and Eli Mason had descended into the choking darkness of the Vale coal shaft, a name that local lore whispered alongside tales of the Vale family's fall from grace, of satanic rites once held deep below their decrepit estate, and of a curse that no man who walked those tunnels ever truly escaped. Eli's injuries slowed them, his blood mixing with the black water that lapped hungrily at their boots. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel, and something far fouler, an ancient rot that clawed at the edges of Charles's sanity. Charles, Eli's voice was ragged, barely more than a tremor. We've got to find the others. Charles nodded, though his mind was a tempest of memories and dread. The faces of those trapped beneath the earth haunted him, friends, strangers, the lost souls who depended on him now. And yet none of that compared to the ghost that lingered beside him, the shadow of Marcus Langston. Marcus, the escaped convict who had once been Charles's fiercest adversary, now his blood brother in this hell. Marcus had given everything for this rescue, his life. When the floodwaters rose like a vengeful tide, swallowing hope and light, Marcus had pushed them through the narrowest escape, sacrificing himself to hold back the collapse, to buy them time. His last breath had been soaked in the bitter taste of mud and regret. Charles swallowed hard, the weight of that sacrifice thickening the air around him. Then there was Dr. Angelina Vale, the woman whose calm strength and haunted eyes had become his lodestar. She had urged him to face the darkness festering in his soul, to step into the abyss rather than run from it. Charles wasn't sure who had saved whom. The distant rumble grew louder, an ominous groan from the depths below. The mine was shifting again, unstable and hungry. We have to move, Charles whispered, gripping Eli's arm, or we won't make it out alive. But the path ahead was blocked by a wall of water and debris, the mine's veins already closing around them like a coffin. Charles felt something brush past his neck, cold and insubstantial. A whisper in a language he didn't know, but felt deep in his bones. The Vale curse wasn't just legend. It was alive. Then came the low, guttural chant, soft at first, then rising in sinister crescendo, a congregation of unseen voices, bound by the darkness of those ancient satanic rites long buried beneath the old manor on the hill. The ground trembled as if the earth itself was awakening, swallowing them whole. Charles pulled out the lighter, The fragile flame flickered like a dying heartbeat, and in that flicker he saw them, pale faces pressed against the tunnel walls, eyes hollow and unblinking, the lost miners, the veil cult's damned, their lips moving in silent incantations that chilled him through and through. Eli gasped, "What is that?" Charles gritted his teeth, stepping forward into the suffocating black. "It's the past, and it's not done with us yet." Above, the storm broke, releasing a thunderous roar that shook the earth. Below, the mine's dark heart pulsed with a life all its own, hungry, endless, and merciless. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, a figure waited, waiting for the living to join the dead. The flame guttered, the voices rose, and Charles knew the veil's curse had only just begun to claim its due.